Okay, thank you for coming back for this second panel. On the first panel, we had some presentation of the Lomé summit and the African initiative to enhance maritime issues. In this panel, we are going to be much more practical. So, Oceans Beyond Piracy was invited by the government of Togo to convene a panel of experts in order to facilitate this summit. We invited some of the world's best experts to a series of focus meetings on various issues. Those meetings were hosted this week in New York City, in Togo premises. And we were very pleased to see some 30 experts answering the call. These experts come from various government agencies covering all the issues, but also for international organizations, from non-governmental organizations, and also from the industry. So we cover basically many various aspects. All these experts are involved daily in one or the other of the 5 topics to be addressed during the African Union Summit, which are piracy, IUU fishing, maritime crime, protection of environment, and maritime economy. So it was very satisfying to see these experts committing their time and their efforts with a very high constructive spirit. That was striking to see their enthusiasm during those meetings. The panel of experts provided valuable advice, which will be summarized by the 4 chairmen of the focus group that I have on my side. And it will be up to the African partners to decide how best to pursue and implement the suggestion that will be presented today by the focus group. In a continuous support to the government of Togo and African Union, Oceans Beyond Piracy is committed to facilitate further discussions with these international experts, and we will provide our support until the end of the summit and beyond if necessary. What we found out was we are discussing about tough challenge. The summit itself is going to be a difficult task, and this has been appreciated by most experts. It's difficult to organize a summit on such a wide issue as maritime issues in a limited time. The risk has been identified. The risk is that the outcome must not be just another piece of paper with no actual implementation. But we have seen, and we appreciate greatly, that the African Union intends to make good progress in maritime matters and to make it quickly within the next decade, so-called decade of the oceans and seas. We salute Togo's leadership in making such a commitment to achieve concrete steps. This summit is an incredible opportunity, and the outcome will be watched closely by the world. As all your presents testified today, thank you again for coming here. We will see what comes on. One question was raised about what is the added value of going Pan-African. Of course, in all different issues examined, there is some added value to handle that at African level. First, African countries have common problems. Most maritime issues are already addressed in specific regions. However, criminal networks thrive in the weakest area, and they connect all regions. If you have a lack of governance here, it creates problems everywhere. This is why these issues must be addressed and tackled across the whole continent. Also, African countries can complete together some common solutions. And actually, some countries achieved already excellent results, as had been shown in various panels. The valuable experience that has been achieved by one country here can be used and implemented across the whole continent. We must use lessons learned in every region. And every panelist here can provide good example in his field of expertise, achieved already in Africa. Again, there is a need for Pan-African coherence. African Union provides a united vision, the AIMS strategy. And this will need no gap for criminals to take advantage. Finally, there is a great benefit from continental cooperation. African Union provides a common forum for all African countries and will encourage all African countries to follow the best practice. Finally, African Union provides a single strong point of contact for outsiders organizations and the private industry out of Africa. So final point is about the blue economy. You may have noticed we had no panel, no focus meeting on blue economy, but we addressed that during all 4 panels. In every single panel, we talked about economy. All the experts agree that the development of blue economy is very closely linked with addressing specific maritime problems. Piracy is a strong deterrent for trade. Conversely, port monitoring creates jobs locally. Fighting crime provides the necessary ground on which legal activity can be developed. IUU fishing prevents legal fishing industry and also is a cause of piracy. Finally, the absence of pollution is the necessary condition for economic development and public health. So as you see, blue economy is part of each of the panel. It is the return of investment, and it is gained through good governance. And the Lomé summit will be an opportunity to explain that once more to all head of states gathered here. Well, I talk enough? Now it's high time for the experts themselves to present the results of their specific panel. Could we start possibly ladies first? Are you ready to? So please.
Good morning, and thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. My name is Lisa Spear. I direct the International Oceans Program with the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a US-based NGO here in New York. I have the honor today to represent the Global Oceans Commission, which I serve as an informal advisor. Christian Talecki of the Commission staff sends his regrets. He had hoped to be here but was unable to attend. The Global Ocean Commission and NRDC view the upcoming Protect Our Oceans Summit in Togo later this year as a key opportunity to raise awareness and bring much greater attention to the importance of conservation and wisely managing our ocean. The Global Oceans Commission met last month with African Union Chairperson Madam Zuma, and I'm pleased to report that the Global Oceans Commission made a commitment to Madam Zuma at that meeting to work with Your Excellencies, colleagues, on the Togo Summit to promote expansion of the agenda beyond security issues. Many of you know the Global Ocean Commission co-chair Trevor Manuel and Commissioner Obi Azizigwili, which I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of, I apologize, who send their greetings to this meeting and who look forward to hearing the outcomes and next steps. Today, more than ever, the ocean is vital for the health and welfare of Africa and its peoples. Products and services from the sea play an important role in meeting the daily nutritional needs of millions and millions of people and are major drivers of national economies. But despite its importance to all Africans, the ocean is not getting the full attention that it needs. Key areas of concern include unsustainable fisheries, inequity, the lack of sufficient focus on the ocean and its role in food security, as well as the lack of monitoring and policing that allows illegal fishing to flourish, with resulting impacts on piracy, security, human rights, and important ecosystems. As we all are aware, there is some excellent movement in Africa on the ocean through the recently adopted 2050 African Integrated Marine Strategy. And this has led, as we all have heard, to the AU declaring Africa's Decade of Seas and Oceans beginning this year, with July 25th marking the Africa's Day of Seas and Oceans. This is a very important step, and it is in the collective interests of Africa to accelerate the action proposed in this strategy and develop a sustainable, thriving blue economy in a secure and environmentally sustainable manner. As all of us are aware, the need for action is urgent. At yesterday's working group meeting, which is focused on conservation and marine biodiversity, we had a very robust discussion of concrete steps that could come out of the summit that could be taken forward to improve the health of the oceans and the ability of the oceans to provide food and economic security to all of Africa. I will outline a few of the steps that we talked about. This list is not comprehensive. We ranged over quite a number of issues, but the ones that emerged as priorities for consideration by the summit were the following. First, the steps that my colleagues, I think, will talk much more about later here today to address piracy and illegal fishing are fundamental to ocean conservation and sustainable use. These steps include ratification of the FAO Port State Agreement and a whole range of other issues that, again, will be talked about later. So the concept here is that monitoring, enforcement, and addressing illegal fishing and piracy is absolutely essential to the conservation of the marine environment and the products and services we derive from it. Second, the workshop concluded that many benefits could be gained by a joint decision to elevate, within multilateral and bilateral discussions involving distant water fishing nations, the importance of eliminating those nations' subsidies that fuel illegal fishing and overfishing. As we all know, subsidies are driving a great deal of the overfishing that we're seeing throughout the world, but particularly in Africa. And having a unified decision to elevate these issues in all international and bilateral, multilateral discussions could begin to raise the pressure on distant water fishing nations to eliminate those subsidies. Third, the workshop recommended consideration of a robust, coordinated AU presence at the negotiations that will begin next year to develop a treaty for the conservation and management of the ocean beyond national jurisdiction. As all of us in this room know, activities beyond the EEZ can have major impacts within the EEZs of Africa, and already I think it's obvious that they are having those impacts. It's critically important that Africa's interests be adequately represented in these negotiations. South Africa has been an outstanding leader in pushing us to this point, and I think it will be very important for other countries to begin to get much more involved as we move toward the negotiations, which will start at the UN in March. Without a robust presence from Africa, we risk leaving decisions affecting the high seas to those who would exploit them in an uncontrolled fashion. Fourth, the workshop recommends consideration of an AU-wide ban on plastic bags. Africa has been a real leader on plastic. Bans, restrictions, and levies have been imposed by Botswana, Eritrea, Kenya, Mauritania, Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and others. The urgency of action on plastic bags was tragically illustrated earlier this month when storm drains in Ghana were blocked by plastic bags, and that resulted in flooding that killed at least 150 people. This plastic bag ban issue is important not just because we need to deal with plastic bags, but it illustrates the larger problem of massive tides of plastic going into the ocean. A ban on plastic bags is not the solution, but it is a first step towards raising public awareness and towards developing comprehensive waste management systems that are needed to keep junk out of the ocean that threatens marine life. Fifth, the workshop recommended consideration of an AU-wide goal of setting aside 10% of the African Ocean as fully protected marine parks. Scientific studies have shown clearly and repeatedly that fully protected areas can help regenerate depleted fish stocks and help economies that rely on those fish stocks rebound. Fish stocks are, again, a critically important food source here. We need to do everything we can to try to ensure a sustainable production of fisheries throughout African waters, and marine protected areas are one way to do that. Finally, we concluded that it might be worth thinking about convening an AU-wide ministerial-level oceans meeting that occurs every 3 to 5 years to adopt goals and assess progress against those goals. It has been the experience of many that having a ministerial-level attention on a regular basis can really help develop the political will to deal with the many, many challenges that Africa and the rest of the world face with respect to managing our oceans. While this list is not exhaustive, it represents the key areas which require action and attention both by African states, the African Union, and the international community. These also have the additional benefit that they're consistent with most of them are consistent, or all of them, with the Sustainable Development Goal number 14. In conclusion, the Global Ocean Commission and NRDC believe it is critical to alert people to the economic, social, and security dangers of poor management and overexploitation of our ocean. Good governance equals economic, social, and ecological benefits, along with security and human rights benefits. Bad governance is economic, ecologic, and social loss. So let me leave you with a final thought. In Senegal, President Sall made history when he canceled all foreign fishing licenses for fisheries operating in Senegalese waters. This means the protection not only of the livelihoods of artisanal fishermen there, but it helps ensure its sustainability for the future. The Protect Our Ocean Summit should highlight and celebrate these kinds of concrete actions that can translate the goal of a healthy, productive ocean into reality. And the Global Oceans Commission looks forward to working with you on that goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for this very clear brief with a structured 6 steps proposed, suggested for our African partners to take over and carry on for the greater environment on which to build their blue economy. I believe it was very clear. I will try to manage some space for a few questions at the end of the meeting, so please hold yourself for later. Next speaker would be John on maritime crime issues. So John, as UNODC specialist, is very well aware of that. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everybody. I chaired the panel which was initially named as a trafficking panel. And I think probably the first conclusion that we came and the strong advice that we want to give to the African Union in the preparation of this summit, that this is too narrow. The subject should really be transnational maritime crime. And the drivers behind that and the crimes that are encompassed in that. And the effect, and as the chairman said, we discussed at great length the blue economy. How detrimental to African development and the blue economy crime is. Transnational organized crime worldwide is $870 billion. A significant proportion of that is conducted at sea. There are a range of maritime crimes that affect the African continent and affect the waters around the African continent and affect the relationship between the continent and other continents as well. It's a multifaceted problem. Addressing it is hugely complicated. In Lomé, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to address the breadth of this. So our advice is to try and bring it down into manageable chunks for discussion. We've produced a list of facilitators that we think can facilitate the discussion in Lomé for this area, and we'll suggest all of that to the organisers that can help bring out and draw out some of these issues. We have experience in this area because in the Indian Ocean, we have developed something that I discussed yesterday at the Counter-Piracy Conference, but something that we call the Indian Ocean Forum for Maritime Crime. It's a grouping of countries, some 21 countries that go from South Africa all the way across to Australia, trying to get together and deal with some of these criminal issues. Just to give you an idea of the range that we're talking about, there are 10 key crimes that we have listed. The Indian Ocean Forum for Maritime Crime is only going to start to address a few of them. But in terms of this African Union Summit, this is something that they need to look at, the breadth of this problem. I won't talk about piracy because it's a separate subject on its own, but it is a key criminal activity. It is trans-border, transnational. Often it's misnamed. Actually, in many cases, it's armed robbery at sea. It doesn't take place in international waters. It takes place in home waters, and it's therefore a national matter, close in. Trafficking in people, probably one of the biggest subjects that's affecting the world at the moment. Trafficking in people and the smuggling of migrants. It is a huge issue, affecting not just the African continent, but seeing the effects in the European continent and elsewhere in Asia. Drug trafficking is a major maritime crime. The transmission of drugs from primarily Afghanistan uses the Indian Ocean as its primary route. And then those drugs go across borders, across continents, and then the sea is used again to move those drugs to other continents and to the European market. All of these crimes that I'm describing have interconnections. Some crimes use the same vessels to transmit drugs, people. It's tied up with the illegal fishing industry. It is a multi-connected business and requires a multifaceted response. We heard this morning in the first session the importance of weapons on the African continent, the smuggling of weapons into Africa. For certain parts of Africa, wildlife crime is a major issue. The illegal trafficking in live animals and rare animals, and all of the criminal activity with the exportation of things like ivory to Asia, all of which uses the sea for its primary transportation. We looked at white collar crime, the loss of revenue to countries who can't afford to lose that revenue from corruption, from illegal licensing, and the misdescription of products in containers in order to avoid revenue. So there's a whole range of white collar crimes that affect ports and the maritime community. Illegal fishing, Robert is going to talk about illegal fishing, but there is, as well as illegal fishing, there are a whole load of other crimes subsumed into it. The use of forced labor as crews on fishing vessels is very prominent. And these crewmen operating and living in appalling conditions, and in some cases then subject to piracy and being held hostage for years on end. I'll run through the rest fairly quickly. The illegal transportation of charcoal, which is a particular East African and Somali problem, the movement of charcoal and the purchase of charcoal, which is subject to UN Sanction 2182. Alcohol and tobacco, export and smuggling, and one I guess that everybody's starting to see in the media again is the possibility of maritime terrorism, the use of by terrorist organizations of ships and vessels to carry out terrorist acts in a number of countries around the continent. And there is a tourism aspect to it too, the effect that then has on tourist locations. Just look at North Africa over the last couple of weeks. So how do we address all these problems? What sort of advice are we giving? Are we going to give the organizers of the summit? Well, the answer to many of these problems is cooperation. We have learned a lot from the counter-piracy operations in Somalia and from what we've been doing in the Indian Ocean Forum for Maritime Crime, helping countries develop the right legal framework. Many countries don't have the right legal framework that would enable their law enforcement and their revenue authorities to deal with some of the crimes that I've described. So looking at legal frameworks, helping develop and drafting laws, and then capacity building for law enforcement. These are massive subjects, which is why we want to refine them down for the summit so that they deal with the key ones. The next area, even if you have these capabilities, is the importance of information sharing and cooperation. We've learned a lot with organizations that were developed for counter-piracy about countries sharing information and the mindset that comes from information and intelligence sharing or criminal intelligence sharing between countries. Even though you may not be able to prosecute a crime yourself, the importance of sharing that information with the receiving state or neighboring states that do have the ability to prosecute. Having shared intelligence and information, the creation of joint investigation work. Countries working together, forming joint investigation teams to deal with specific individual crimes that flow across borders. And then finally, a joint prosecution network, the training of judges and prosecutors so that they have the expertise to deal with these range of maritime crimes. It's a highly complex subject. It is something that Africa as a continent has to address. In the end, it's all about the economy and bringing into relatively poor economies that wealth that stems from the maritime revenue. Just before I finish, one of the subjects we majored on in our group was the migration question. And we had a long discussion about migration, the culmination of which was that we need to try and make migration safe and the safety aspects of migration, to reduce the loss of life, to look at countries' responsibilities, and to look at the responsibility of industry, particularly the shipping industry, playing their role. In many cases, it's the shipping industry that deals with this problem at the front end, and the effect that has on crews and ship owners and their companies. It's a complex area in itself, and something that probably worth laboring and putting a lot of attention to at the summit. So that was the gambit of what we discussed. Plenty of advice out there, plenty of expertise that can help the facilitators of this conference come up with some key deliverables. But our group wanted to stress the technical aspects of this. Yes, there is always a political dimension, and there needs to be political agreement. But if you get technicians together to discuss some of these issues and problems, then you can come up with practical solutions. Joint investigations, intelligence sharing, information sharing, prosecutions, and cooperation with industry are all things that we've had experience in other in other agendas, and something that we can bring to this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for exposing us first all the stakes of maritime crime and demonstrating how linked all the crimes are, and then providing the only solution, which is increased cooperation in all technical fields that need to be addressed one by one for a solution. And with a final thought, of course, of this dramatic problem of migrants at sea who too often lose their lives and need to be addressed too. So thanks a lot for that. And well, now it's time for Robert to tell us about your findings on illegal fishing and how to address that. Thank you.
So thank you. My name is Robert Mazurek, and I am the director of Secure Fisheries. Secure Fisheries is an offshoot of Oceans Beyond Piracy, working to strengthen the coordination within countries and between countries for both combating illegal fishing and also ensuring sustainable fisheries. Before I get started on kind of the things that we discussed in the workshop yesterday, I wanted to just go into the fact that the foundation for this African Union summit in November, is the 2050 AIM strategy. And one of the goals of the 2050 AIM strategy is a comprehensive, concerted, coherent, and coordinated approach that improves maritime conditions. And one of the biggest threats to that goal of improving maritime conditions is illegal fishing. Just how significant is it? It's a $23 billion a year problem worldwide. In Africa, it's upwards of $2 billion. So on both East and West Africa, it is significant. West Africa, there's been some estimates that it costs West Africa $1.3 billion. So, this runs the gamut. Illegal fishing runs the gamut of kind of what it does to both the marine environment through harming, damaging stocks, damaging sensitive ecosystems, and creating bycatch by killing birds, turtles, sharks, and marine mammals. But it also has an economic impact, obviously, like I just talked about, but through the loss of revenue from licensing and the loss of export potential for some of this fish that is not being caught by these countries. It also, which is something that is often overlooked, has a social impact. there's conflict with domestic and artisanal fishers. There's food security issues within countries, especially. I mean, there's food security issues in Yemen right now with the blockades and the fact that that fish is not entering that marketplace anymore. And it undermines the rule of law, which is also another social impact. So one of the things that the AIM strategy, which the Maritime Conference is based on, talks about is rather than recreating another plan for illegal fishing, we should focus our efforts on implementing some existing plans. And they identify two existing plans for marine conservation in general. One is NEPAD's 2005 Abuja Declaration on Sustainable Fisheries and Aquaculture, and the 2010 Conference of African Ministers of Fisheries and Aquaculture. Those are two things that have been put forth in 2005, 2010, and rather than recreate the wheel, the AIM strategy calls for implementing both of those. However, though it touches on marine conservation, the Abuja Declaration doesn't directly address illegal fishing. So that's not a good starting point for addressing illegal fishing. The CAMP document addresses illegal fishing in two ways. By first saying that we should adopt and implement the FAO Plan of Action to prevent, deter, and eliminate IUU fishing, which came out in 2001, and to ratify FAO's Port State Measures Agreement. So those are very specific things that the AU has agreed are important. So the question is, how well is the African Union doing in both of those regards? In regard to the FAO Plan of Action to combat illegal fishing, 18 countries worldwide have created an individual national plan of action to combat illegal fishing. Since 2001. They were hoping that all of the countries around the world would have created this national plan of action within 3 years of 2001. So this obviously hasn't happened. In Africa, only Ghana has created a national plan of action to combat illegal fishing. So despite the African Union's desire to move forward with this, only one country so far has done that since 2001. The other kind of significant way to combat illegal fishing, which has been recognized by the FAO and implemented internationally in some cases, is the Port State Measures Agreement. But the Port State Measures Agreement by the United Nations will not get ratified until 25 countries ratify it. Specifically, the Port State Measures addresses vessels entering port, which is obviously the easiest way to combat illegal fishing. Rather than chase these boats around the high seas and around EEZs, by strengthening port enforcement, you could combat illegal fishing in very specific places. Because I mean, the fact is, we know where the major processing hubs around the world are, and if you direct efforts on strengthening port controls in these areas where the processing hubs are, it will go a long way into combating illegal fishing. So through vessel inspections at port, and the fact that these vessel inspections will be communicated to relevant states. So the Port State Measures Agreement, as I mentioned, is going to only take effect if 25 countries ratify it. And so far, 12 countries have ratified it, 3 in Africa. So Gabon, Mozambique, and the Seychelles have ratified it. So one thing that we talked about at the workshop yesterday, and a seemingly low-hanging fruit, but something that can make a significant impact in combating illegal fishing, is the ratification of the Port State Measures Agreement. And the African Union alone, being that there's 12 countries that have already ratified it, and we need 25, the African Union alone could ensure its ratification all by itself. So that was one of the things we discussed yesterday. Some other things is to create a mechanism for increased collaboration, coordination, and reporting between countries to fight illegal fishing. There is a good example of this already happening right now in East Africa with the Fisheye Project. The Fisheye Project is a collaboration of 7 countries that are sharing intelligence. And so if one country fishes in an EEZ, if a fishing vessel is fishing in an EEZ of one country and is offloading in another country, for instance, the Seychelles, that is relayed to the Seychelles government and law enforcement and could be a lot more easily prosecuted. So creating a mechanism like the Fisheye Project throughout Africa, through creating regional hubs of information sharing, would make a significant improvement in combating illegal fishing. The other thing we discussed yesterday is the creation of an AU database on fisheries regulations and fisheries laws. If the Port State Measures Agreement, or really any collaboration between countries to combat illegal fishing is going to work, each country needs to have a firm grasp of what the laws are for each other's countries. And a big problem with that is there's no central clearinghouse for understanding fisheries laws in country by country. So the creation of an African Union database on fisheries regulations and fisheries laws would allow countries to ensure that through port controls, ensure that that laws from, say, one country that are broken are enforced in another country when they're offloading these fish. The other thing we talked about is the creation of minimum standards for access agreements and trade agreements. A lot of times, both of these things are clouded in mystery, and especially in regard to trade agreements. But a large thing lacking in illegal fishing, in combating illegal fishing and fisheries management in general, is more knowledge about fisheries resources. We scientists just do not in Africa have a good grasp on the health of fish stocks. So, for instance, if you created minimum standards for access agreements and trade agreements that said that you have to that these fishing boats that are entering your waters and fishing in a specific country's EEZ have to, for instance, create a database of the fish they're catching, when they're catching it, how big they are, would go a long way. I mean, Somalia is a good example of a country that right now has trade agreements with various vessels, but there is no data collection whatsoever on what is being caught. And so in order to properly manage a fishery, you have to have some semblance of information on the impact of fishing on these resources. And currently, there's no such thing. So creating these minimum standards for trade agreements would go a long way to collect some of this data, and for various other reasons. Another thing we talked about yesterday is the creation of both African Union priorities and country-specific priorities to guide international capacity building. There, as everybody in this room knows, there's a lot of both UN initiatives and NGO initiatives to build capacity throughout the African Union, and especially in regards to combating illegal fishing. But the African Union needs to state what their priorities are in terms of building capacity for these initiatives. So far, I think a lot of NGOs are dealing with a certain segment of African Union countries and making it up as they go along. But a leadership from the African Union to guide what these priorities should be to build capacity to tackle illegal fishing would be a huge step. Another thing we talked about yesterday is the updating of country-specific legislation. A lot of fisheries legislation throughout Africa, in many cases, was created 30, 40, 50 years ago. In some cases, it was created before fisheries were industrialized. And the updating of these fisheries laws that really specify what rules and regulations are related to fishing in EEZs and throughout the African Union would be a huge step to strengthen the combating of illegal fishing. And the last thing that we talked about, which Lisa alluded to earlier, was using the AIM strategy as a template to create an AU division for the coordination of maritime issues. There, as all three of us have talked about right now, there are maritime issues that are very related. Illegal fishing is related to drug smuggling, is related to human trafficking, is related to slavery, and the coordination of all of these maritime conflicts and maritime issues needs to be raised to a higher level. So those are the 7 different recommendations that we had, and note none of these recommendations involve creating another planning document or another report. All of these recommendations are something that that through this summit the African Union could do today in the short term. So that's what we were trying to achieve with this, and I think we did.
Thank you a lot, Robert, for this impressive presentation. First of the stakes, when $1.3 billion, this is not something that people would discard easily. Plus social impact and economic potential, that's great. And thank you a lot for these very concrete steps that the group has come to suggest with only existing plans that just wait to be implemented, and as you mentioned, low-hanging fruits. So the effort to take the fruit is minimal. The last presentation will be Véronique about the piracy issue, a complex issue in its own, and but the discussion were as rich as for the other panel. So please, Véronique.
Thank you, Jérôme, and hello to everyone. First, I must confess that we didn't discuss much piracy in our group. We discussed everything. Second, the first point was we first expressed our worriness about a new initiative on maritime security and safety. Minister Ducé is here. He knows that that was a worry that we had from the outset. We have shared these thoughts with him. But in the end, what we said and what we have always said is that if there is a political initiative, if there is one country and a whole union who are willing to take political leadership to raise the level of awareness and of commitment on one issue, then it's all for the good. So we decided that we would support that. That was the first point. But we mentioned that there are lots of, we've been discussing now after the uprising of piracy in East Africa and then the issues in the Gulf of Guinea and so on. We've been discussing an illegal fishing and whatever, discussing at length those issues, but there are no precise reporting assessments, figures that are shared. So that might be an opportunity for the Lomé summit to once and for all share some precise and accurate data on all the issues. And if, because our group was piracy, maybe there are a number of figures, but and that's there, I think a number of colleagues in this room know, but just to to mention the fact that, for example, piracy in the Horn of Africa would, for an investment of $10,000, be a gain of $5 million. So you see the ratio and how lucrative this activity is. And the fact that the international community spent overall since 2008 $2 billion per year to cope with this issue. And the fact that despite that, of course, because of our international investment and because of all the money that the shipping companies have spent and that we, with our naval forces, we have spent, the issue in East Africa has been stabilized. But we all know that it has not been solved, because those guys, and I'm happy to see a representative from the prosecutor's office in Somalia here in this room, because those guys are still up and running. I guess my colleagues in the contact group might be bored to hear me saying always the same thing, but those guys who are subject of an international arrest warrant are still running and sharing money and power with the authorities in Somalia. I'm very clear on that, and I don't have any problem with saying it, because when Hassan Sheikh, the president of Somalia, came in Paris, we said it face to face. He was not very happy to hear that, but it's the truth. And the fact that he came just after 3 days after Mohamed Garfanji, one of those kingpins, had been released, with the authorization of the government in Somalia. For us, the international community, who have invested so much in combating this scourge, you can imagine what in French we have the word affront. I don't know how to say that in English. It's not acceptable. We've been working, and what is the Somali government doing? It's releasing the guy who is subject of an arrest warrant. So now we are focusing on the trial of the so-called Afwene, who is now jailed in Belgium. His trial will start in September, and we goddamn hope that this guy will have a good prosecution and will never leave jail, because he has lots of lives on his hands, and he has lots of our money, our contributors' money, in his pockets, and we don't want to let that continue. In the Gulf of Guinea, the figures for piracy are also high, and the problem is a little bit the same. It's a problem of corruption, it's a problem of governance. The highest reported numbers of attacks was in 2013, 169 attacks. Then we heard that it had decreased in 2014, 120 attacks. And we hear from our colleagues from the oil and gas companies that in 2015 it is increasing again. Against those attacks, you had also some hostage taking, 30 hostages in 2014. For us, France, we had two, which are already too much for us, two French people who were taken hostages, and we had to organize a huge special forces operation to go and rescue them, including, unfortunately, into territorial waters of a given country, which was very difficult to organize. So it's a big challenge, the security of and someone this morning was talking about the seafarers. Our shipping industry is telling us that the seafarers do not want to go in those areas anymore, because they are afraid, first, that it's one of the most difficult jobs in the whole world. You can live down in those machine rooms. It's one of the most appalling jobs. You work in terrible conditions. If you work in those terrible conditions, and in addition you run the risk of being abducted or being kidnapped or whatever, you don't want. So shipping companies have a problem, a social problem to solve, a security problem to solve. They have to take care of their seafarers. the other, so those are the figures that we could share on piracy. Then, because our colleague mentioned the issue of illegal fishing, and I think that I've read, I think, a Kofi Annan report, if I may, even if it's not my issue, but I gathered some very interesting figures about illegal fishing. They were saying, it was in this Kofi Annan report, saying that losses for illegal fishing are from $2 to $5 billion per year, and that there are 2.3 million persons in Africa, so 1/4 of the active population of Africa, who live on fishing and aquaculture. So these are important figures to remember. Then on illegal trafficking and so on, we would have also lots of figures to share, and it would be good if the Lomé summit would be an opportunity to once and for all make a very precise assessment of what's going on. Our third point was that please do not produce another 40 pages charter that no one is going to read. Raise your hands. Who has read fully the AIM 250 strategy? Okay, good. We are, how many are we in this room? And we have only 2 hands raised, 3, okay. Who has read, okay, let's say, who has read the AIM 250 strategy, the Yaoundé Summit documents, the Djibouti Code of Conduct documents, the UNCLOS, all those documents that we should all know by heart if we are maritime specialists, but we have not, okay? We have not. So please, Minister Dussé, please, the AU, do not produce another document that we will not read, that you will not read, and that your heads of states and governments will not read. This is the problem. So what we would recommend, this was the recommendation of our group, was that we have a 1 or 2 pages paper. That's it. 1 or 2 pages paper, which would recall those very documents that we have not read, all of them, and many of us have quoted a number of instruments that ought to be quoted in this preamble. And then, actually, I have a draft of this paper, and we've made copies of it so that it can be distributed. And then 4 or 6 articles, very simple. First, we have all the instruments, the legal instruments that are needed in Africa or in the world for maritime security and safety to be once and for all implemented. The only thing that we need to do, and the only thing that would be needed for Africa, if Africa wants to hold a Maritime and Development Summit, is to introduce fully into its domestic law the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is key, and this is these are the basics. We would have recommended in our group a deadline for that, because this convention has been signed for a while by the majority of countries in Africa, but it has not been introduced into domestic law. So there would be a deadline, and there would be a reporting proposed to the AU at least 1 year after the Lomé summit. So on the 8th of November 2016, heads of state and government of Africa are supposed to report to the AU on how they have introduced into their domestic law UNCLOS. Second, they would also have to introduce into their domestic law all those instruments that would be mentioned in the preamble. The Yaoundé Code of Conduct, the Djibouti Code of Conduct, many other instruments which have been signed, which we have discussed at length in lengthy meetings so many times, spending time, but nothing is done in this regard. How come? So if we're going to have another conference, another summit, let's be efficient. Let's implement those instruments. Let's introduce them into domestic laws of those countries. Then one point which is very dear to us, and I've just mentioned the fact that kingpins are still up and running in some countries. It's the same case in Nigeria. Everyone knows them. Everyone knows that they have some acquaintances, very strong acquaintances, at least with the former government. Everyone knows that the concession for the public service for the maritime security in Nigerian waters was given to Tom Polo, who is the leader of the Niger Delta Liberation Movement. So this is not acceptable. And we know that the main issue is to struggle against the impunity of maritime criminals. So that would be one article. Adopt every political and legal measure that would enable African heads of state and government to struggle against the impunity of maritime criminals. And then to do that, you need to strengthen police and judicial cooperation, because this is one big problem. If you don't have appropriate police cooperation and judicial cooperation, the criminals, they have a cooperation and they have no borders, they know how to go from one country to another to escape justice. And that should be dealt with by this summit. One other key point is the fact that, and I heard this morning Ambassador Zanzou from Benin mention that. I took note of it. Where did I take my notes? Saying we need more support from our development partners. We've been supporting for years and years. I've quoted the number of dollars that we've spent in East Africa. We've done the same in other parts of Africa. I agree with some mentions this morning of weapons production, of oil and gas industry. There is a balance to be struck there. But at the same time, there is plenty of money in Africa. There are plenty of taxes paid in Africa, at least by oil and gas companies. Total, for example, in Nigeria, pays 90% of taxes on its activities in Nigeria. 90%. Of course, if they still work on that issue, have this work, despite paying 90% of taxes, it's because the 10% give them enough money and are sufficiently interesting. I agree with that. But still, 90% of taxes paid by Total to Nigeria means that Nigeria ought to be able to ensure the security of the job that is carried out by all the people who work in the Total platforms and that go back and forth through ships from land to those platforms and everything. It's not the case. Nigeria imposes on Total to work with Nigerian private security companies. First, imposes on Total to work with Nigerian Navy. This is normal, this is legitimate. But it imposes to pay the Nigerian Navy. So Nigerian Navy should be paid by Nigeria. They have a salary through those taxes. But no, Total has to pay those guys. So don't ask us a support from development partners. I think this should be a vocabulary banned from our discussions. We are supposed to cooperate. So one line in this charter should be that heads of state and government of Africa should, I have the word in French, but should identify from the date of the charter the appropriate budgetary lines in their budgets, in their national budgets, for maritime security, human and budgetary resources to be available every single year in every single African budget. And this is a commitment that if this charter can get, you would have achieved a lot. Because what we see in our work is that we are creating lots of structures but let's talk about Ambassador Zanzou from Benin was talking about the inter-regional coordination center in Yaoundé, about the center that they have opened in Cotonou. We have also the Douala, the Pointe-Noire Center in Congo, regional maritime coordination centers. We only have walls and tables and a few human resources now. We need more resources to create, if we're talking about information sharing, to create some secure information and interoperable communication system. And if you are going to go Pan-African, you would have maybe to organize such a Pan-African system. We already have it's already difficult to organize regional systems. So at least we should start, because always the answer is, oh, sorry, we don't know, we don't have the money, we don't know where to get the money, and so on. So we need a commitment to identify precise budgetary lines in the national budgets. We also need, because lots of those maritime issues go through work carried out or given by heads of state and governments to some sub-regional organizations. At least in the Gulf of Guinea, ECAS and ECOWAS have been appointed by the Gulf of Guinea heads of state and government to implement the strategies. And in East Africa, we have a number of instruments which have not been implemented because those sub-regional organizations say, we agree we can do the job, but the member states do not pay their contributions to us, so we don't have the money to second this or that member staff to this or that center. So in this charter, there would be also a commitment by heads of state and governments and maybe by the secretary generals of those organizations that specific budgets in those sub-regional organizations would have to be identified for those sub-regional organizations to be able to carry out the work that they are supposed to do. I think I'll stop there. And the last point in the draft charter that we would share is that there is a clause de rendezvous year after year, and the first clause of rendezvous is 1 year after the Lomé summit. Report should be made to the African Union on the implementation of those measures. Thank you.
I have to thank a lot Véronique for a very passionate report of debates which actually were that passionate when they happened. So she reflected in a very well way. Also, you notice that all the speakers here mention always cooperation, implementation. I mean, we did not give any guidance to them. They did not speak to each other before the meeting. It's just that these are the main issues coming back from all kinds of problems. So, of course, what you have heard here is just the opinion expressed by the world's best experts and recommendation for Africa, for Togo and African Union. Their recommendation, with all their expertise, all their passion, so that Africa might improve a greater control over your own maritime space. It is now up to the Africans themselves to absorb these recommendations and put them for good effect. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some time. Possibly we can open the floor for a couple of questions, and we'll try. Well, I see that there are lots of demands for questions, so if I want to be able to leave this room, I need to open the floor for a couple of questions. Let me open that. Do we have a microphone somewhere? Yes, we have at the rear of the room. Please, as previously, introduce yourself and state your question slowly. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Giles Noakes from BIMCO, which is the largest of the independent shipping trade associations. I sat on Veronique's panel, which was, as Michelle has said, very passionate, and I would support every single sentence that she has said. You have not heard one word from the shipping industry. You have heard the shipping industry quoted. You've heard the shipping industry talked about. But a vast proportion of this issue is actually about shipping. We are involved. We want to be involved. And there is a major driver for being involved. And that is if trade, which is going to help Africa develop and create a circle that doesn't get broken by maritime security problems, then there has to be a solution, because we will just keep going round in ever decreasing circles. And that is why this charter is terribly important, because the shipping industry is getting very, very fed up. And you have all been given, I think, today, copies of the OBP 2014 report. And in that you can see, both in East Africa and West Africa now, the shipping industry is bearing the brunt of the costs of protecting itself from maritime crimes. In the main, that document focuses on piracy. But please be assured, certainly in my job as the head of security for BIMCO, we are addressing the smuggling of drugs on a regular basis through MOUs with various countries. We are particularly concerned by people smuggling and mass migration. This is not just a problem in the Mediterranean from the Maghreb states. It is a huge problem going on today, this minute, in the Gulf of Aden, where thousands of Somalis who were smuggled into the Yemen are now actually trying to get back to Somalia, ironically. So there are huge numbers of problems the shipping industry face that are Pan-African. And unless there is a Pan-African solution to this, we will continue to struggle to help what the shipping industry can do for Africa, which is to help develop its commercial trade and earn money and taxes to pay for that which needs to be done. Thank you.
So I understand that it was not really a question, but more helping to pass the message. Thank you a lot, Giles, for that. What would be the next question? Where's the microphone, please?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ayara Bukar from Somali delegation. My question, and I think it's also a message to the member state of the European Union. It comes back to, I think, the very passionate urge from Veronique. I think I'm speaking on behalf of the Somali delegation. What I'm saying that we are fully really committed to the persecution and the conviction of the pirates. It pains all of us to come to this kind of forums, and we know that we are doing a lot of job to build the capacity of our institutions. At the same time, we have these criminals going around. I think when you are in Somalia, you can understand it. The fragile context. We are facing an enemy like Al-Shabaab, but these pirates are supposed also to be behind bars. So you have our full commitment. But there's also another, I think, request from our part. My colleagues in Mogadishu, they are working right now on listing the shipping, the companies who are taking part of the illegal fishing. There has been emails and requests to the regions to register whatever companies they see conducting illegal fishing. We heard yesterday, I think, the statements of our head of delegation, Sheikh Isa, when we talked about the impact of illegal fishing. So this is a request actually to the member states as to commit themselves for the persecution, and I think also putting these kind of companies on the list that they belong. It's also criminal activity, I think, and that they should be also seriously charged, just as the pirates. So I think it should be a commitment from both sides, and it's also a plea, I think, to all of you to be our partners to stop the illegal fishing in the coast of Somalia. And I think that goes also for other parts of Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you a lot for this call for cooperation. Can we take a few more questions, and then we will give a time for the replies? Please, can you bring the microphone closer? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name's Eric Brandenburg. I'm with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia, based in Mogadishu. And our Security Council mandate is to facilitate and assist the federal government of Somalia in developing their security sector institutions, including the maritime domain. And as my colleague John Steed emphasized, Somalia faces huge proportion of transnational crimes. Migration, the ban on charcoal exports from Somalia, the toxic waste dumping that's happening, and first and foremost is illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. So what I would ask of the forum and the Lomé summit, which will take place in November, is to develop some interim measures for not just Somalia, but other states in Africa. Because as we know, the cycle that it takes from the conceptual stage to the actual implementation stage, where a Coast Guard or maritime law enforcement entity has the capacity to execute police or law enforcement powers at sea takes time. And I'm talking about the development of the training of crews to actually take a platform to sea and execute those law enforcement powers at sea. That is a long-term capacity development initiative. So what the Lomé Summit needs to do is come up with some kind of interim measures and not develop a 40-page document, as Veronique explained, but develop some real solutions to real challenges that Somalia has and other coastal states in Africa. Those interim measures for surveillance and operational capability for a coastal state in Africa like Somalia to secure its territorial seas against illegal fishing and other crimes. And that can be something in the interim as simple as a private company providing the platform with the seamanship, engineering skills, and capability, and embarking Somali law enforcement officials to do the stop, board, search, and seizure capability until the country has that capability to get underway, go to sea with its own platforms and its own capability. So again, I'd ask the Lomé Summit, come up with some interim solutions, concrete interim solutions for Somalia and other coastal states so they can develop their capacity in the long run. Thank you.
We might have enough question for, no, we take all the questions first? Okay, so have more questions? Ambassador, please.
First of all, thank you all very, very much. I lived in Sierra Leone for a number of years, and what was happening there, this was about illegal fishing, is that there were Asian, probably Japanese, Chinese, other Asian vessels that were capturing a lot of fish, either outside territorial waters or maybe inside territorial waters. And they had ice capacity, freezing capacity, which none of the Sierra Leone vessels certainly had. And there was no Coast Guard capacity whatsoever in Sierra Leone. So there was no way for the Sierra Leone government to apprehend any of these boats. And none of these boats, to my knowledge, ever entered a port in Africa. I'm sort of referring to your point about sort of doing some kind of log of the ones that come in to African ports. So my question, maybe you've already discussed this among yourselves, is what about all these Asian high-speed refrigerated vessels that are taking so much of this fish? And is that part of your remit? So this is not so much, well, you could say it's criminal, but, you know, it's economic, and So are you all, one of you or somebody, approaching the government of Japan, approaching the government of China, approaching the representatives in Hong Kong or somebody else? Because there might be some way to get some more realistic focus on these issues. Thank you very much.
Do we have one last question, and then we open for the panelists the answer? One last question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Deepak Shetty, Director General of Shipping in the Government of India again. This is just to take a cue from what John Steed indicated. There are typically 10 strands of maritime criminal offenses. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the bottom line is that these are all predicate offenses for a humongous amount of money laundering and terrorist financing issues. I do not know as to how much of attention we have focused and engaged ourselves in picking up financial trails of what has happened to the huge amounts of ransoms paid on piracy instances. Dare I say that in the 7 years of work of the contact group, and I'm saying this with utmost deference and humility, at the end of the day, what do we have in terms of detection of monies that have been picked up? Has there been any asset freezing? Has there been any forfeiture? Has there been any confiscation of money? What do we have to show as an international community at the end of the 7 years of work that we've produced? Nothing more than tomes of reports. Again, I'm saying I'm not being bitterly critical. I admit, I myself as an economic law enforcement functionary, it's an extraordinary challenge to do so. But for God's sake, I think, do we say at the end of the 7 years that we have worked, that we have not been able to pick up any amount of these financial trails? We have the entire paradigm of FATF 40+9 recommendations on money laundering, counter-terrorist financing. What have we really done about it? I mean, it's really a parody and a really sort of really pathetic that we as an international community are not able to produce results for this. And this is where I would commend that when you look at the Lomé Convention, this is where you need to head for. That at the end of the day, you might well have the capacity for law enforcement, for criminal justice. But I think if you're able to squeeze the financial strands of criminal activity, I think you need to go in for the financial jugular. And that means you need to choke the financial arteries of criminal offenses. And that's the only way if you want to stymie and bottle crime. And that's my considered view. The second is we have the entire paradigm of seafarers who have been impacted time and again. You have two broad subsets whom the international community deliberates. One is those seafarers who have been impacted, victimized by piracy and armed robbery instances, who have successfully come back home after a prolonged periods or whatever periods that they have been in captivity. Then there's another set of people who have been completely forgotten about. And this is in terms of those who in the custody of pirates have disappeared for various reasons over a period of time. I'm getting emotional because there's an Indian guy who's still not accounted for the last 3 years. And I'm sort of very I'm charged to say that nowhere in the contact group there's even so much as even a statistical reference to the fact that these guys who are missing, they need to be accounted for, and that someone needs to pay and ensure that the countries that are jurisdictionally responsible for this, they must bring them to book and at least bring these cases formally to a close. Now, for instance, in the case that I'm referring to, we have had Interpol yellow corner notices issued, retreated again and again. But at the end of it, there's not even a shred of evidence to indicate as to what has happened to that person. And it's a pity that in the entire proceeding of the contact group, you don't even refer to them as a piece of stat. All we seek is to seek the release of the others. We don't even recognize that there's another set of people who haven't come back home, are not even accounted for. Nobody knows their whereabouts. Nobody is able to trace them out. And they seem to be a completely forgotten lot. I mean, is this what, so that's my earnest appeal that the international community must recognize this as a serious issue and spend some time and engage in this. And same goes for the Gulf of Guinea. There are any number of seafarers who are missing, have not come back. Do we not look at them as well? Thank you so much.
I apologize for the many other people who wish to ask questions, but if I open for more questions, we have no time at all for any answer. So for the answers, please, some questions were very specific to some countries, but we are in the context of preparation of African Union Summit. So please try to enlarge your reply in the context of Pan-African reply. Thank you so much. Who wishes to talk first? Okay, so everybody wishes to talk. John, please.
Well, I hope some of the rest of the panelists will answer some of the other questions, but I always go for the low-hanging fruit and the things I know most about. So I'll try and address Deepak Shetty's question relating to hostages. I mean, I totally agree with him. He knows very well that I run the hostage support program that tries to locate and release those hostages that we call the forgotten hostages. And we've had some great success. We've released over 70 hostages who were taken ashore after their ships had either sunk or been ransomed away, and were largely forgotten about by their countries and by their ship owners, or they were incapable of dealing with them. And we've had some success. I really wanted to show a short video that OBP produced to the contact group yesterday, but there wasn't time on the agenda for it, which would have had you crying in your seats for the remaining 26 hostages as those men begged for their lives. I'm confident that we are going to get them free sometime, I hope, this coming year. But as Mr. Shetty rightly says, there are also a lot of seafarers that we've released over the last couple of years who have suffered significant trauma, mental trauma, and are still suffering today. And it's thanks to the efforts of the shipping industry that have contributed to a number of charities that enable some support to go to these families. It's not just the families of those who've been returned, it's the families of those who've died. A lot of seafarers have died, have been tortured, or have been left to die by these awful people. And those charities like MPRHRP have done great work in trying to look after the families of the returned hostages and those that are still missing and those that have died. It takes funding and it takes money, and there's not a huge amount of money around for this sort of work. So if any of you as countries are feeling able to donate even small amounts of money, will help with the welfare, the important welfare work that goes on. There are also forgotten hostages, as Mr. Shetty points out, that we have no idea where they are. We do everything in my program to try and identify these missing hostages. This is specifically in Somalia, but with OBP's help, we're hoping that we might extend that to the other areas affected by piracy and hostage taking. There are missing people that have just disappeared. Even the pirates don't claim ownership of them. They've probably died. They are buried somewhere, but yet there is a family in India or Korea or Thailand whose loved one is missing and they have no idea where they are. So we have a duty to try and identify and do what we can to find and bring an end for those families. So I hope you'll continue to support that work. We certainly need to extend it to the whole of the continent, in particular the missing hostages in West Africa as well. So a long answer, but it is a cause that I'm very passionate about. And I absolutely agree. In the end, we must bring somebody to book. There are prosecutions going on in Europe, as you've heard from Veronique, but very few. And these people are still operating in Somalia. I know they're operating because they call me. They are trying to extract money for the release of the remaining hostages. So they're still at large, and they need to be brought to book. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but sometime they are going to appear on the horizon, and we will have the opportunity to arrest them. But that requires, that word again, cooperation. information sharing between law enforcement, evidence collection, and that painful process that leads eventually to a successful prosecution. But it's a very good point, so thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, John. Because safety of the sailor is the precondition before trade can come to a normal level. There was mention also about IUU fishing. I'm sure Robert has a few things to say about cooperation on this field. Thank you, Robert.
So some of the things that were mentioned were specifically related to Somalia, and others were a little bit more general. I wanted to touch on your point in regard to foreign boats fishing in African waters and offloading their fish in other ports. One significant change that has been made for a country that does a lot of offshore fishing is in South Korea. And in December, South Korea was encouraged, and they did it. They amended their Distant Water Fisheries Act. And now their Distant Water Fisheries Act says that their boats, and I'm talking not only about the flag state, but also about Korean ownership in a boat, cannot fish in areas that are considered ungoverned or have poor governance. So, for instance, there's boats that are fishing up and down Somalia's coast that are from South Korea, and now for the first time, the South Koreans have the opportunity to prosecute these boats. There's issues with that. One in particular is trying to find the ownership of these boats, and that's not always easy. That tracking that path from the seafarers that are on the boats back to who owns the boats is difficult. But South Korea is vested in identifying who owns these boats that are fishing in ungoverned areas, and hopefully now that this amendment has been passed, prosecuting these folks. So that is a significant change that goes along with what you were saying. A lot of the boats in the area around Somalia land their fish, however, in Djibouti and Mombasa and areas like that. And from what we could gather, it's a lot of bribing that goes on, even if there's information sharing that these boats were fishing illegally. And there's also a prosecution side to it, where some of these law enforcement representatives need a pretty high proof that these boats were fishing illegally, and a lot of times that proof doesn't exist. Like logbooks, for instance, a lot of these illegal fishing boats do not keep very good logbooks, so it's not like one of these boats could be boarded and their logbooks could be searched and identify that these boats were fishing illegally. So that's a challenge. One of the other things I wanted to touch on is fisheries legislation, and in particular to Somalia. Somalia, a month ago, 6 weeks ago now, passed a new fisheries legislation. And this fisheries legislation specifically states that their licensing scheme moving forward will change in the sense that they will identify stocks, sustainable stocks in Somalia, and only allow foreign boats to fish those stocks that are A, sustainable, and B, not being utilized by their domestic fishery. So kind of what they consider the excess fish. And that is a significant change, and I think it'll be harder in practice to achieve, but that's a significant change in fisheries legislation that is a huge step forward.
So legal implementation and international cooperation. Thank you, and I'm sure you could talk hours about the topic very easily. Lisa has also some answers to provide. Please do.
Yes, just very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. I wanted to just step back for a moment and emphasize that healthy oceans are the basis of security. If you don't have a healthy ocean, you don't have any fish, you don't have any tourism, you don't have employment, and you don't have the kind of activity that can keep people out of piracy. So thinking about the ocean and its health as a key element of maritime security in Africa is critically important. I hope the summit will consider some of the concrete steps that can be taken together that don't require massive influxes of money, that are within the control of, oh, it's cutting out, sorry, that are within the control of the African governments, including things like elevating subsidies and compliance in bilateral and multilateral negotiations that take place with distant water fishing nations in particular, like creating marine protected areas that can help rebuild depleted fish stocks, like engaging robustly in the high seas negotiations that will have a very significant impact on Africa over time. These kinds of steps can be taken. They don't require a huge infrastructure. They don't require reports. They require some pretty basic actions and can be implemented very quickly. So just a reminder about the importance, again, of ocean health in maritime security.
Thank you, Lisa, reminding us all the issues are linked. Apologize for His Excellency Mr. Doucet. We're eating your final time, but I'm sure that you would gladly listen to what Veronique has to say again before we give you back the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for allowing me some remarks. Maybe on what Giles said, just to emphasize the fact that yes, the trade, goes international trade goes through the seas. Everyone knows that 90% of trading around the world goes through the seas, and that 90% of the trade from and to Africa goes by the seas. And we've had a joke within our little community. We say no shipping, no shopping. So that's really important to keep in mind. On illegal fishing, if I may, I know it's not my specialty, but thank you for the Somali delegation commitment to prosecute all criminals. And when I mentioned in the draft chart that we are going to share with everyone, prosecution of criminality, it means every type of criminality, including illegal fishing. And I want to give the example of Senegal, who has been extremely efficient in the recent years in arresting Russian illegal fishing, Russian boats, etc., etc. So there is quite a lot of potential within Africa on this issue. And whether we are, because there was this question asked yesterday by Sheikh Issa, whether the naval forces present in the Indian Ocean could share data on illegal fishing. I think that with the $2 billion we spent per year since 2008, we've contributed to establish some information sharing centers, information fusion centers in the area. And those centers ought to be used to trigger this type of information sharing. We should start by what exists in the region rather than tapping on the international resources as ever. We are talking about an African summit, but of course we will be there to cooperate always. There was something else on illegal fishing that was. On money laundering and assets freezing, I think that it's a key point. Yes, we know the account numbers of some of those Garfangé and Afouene that we've mentioned, which are in Dubai, which are in London, which are everywhere. And everyone knows those bank accounts. But I hope that the Law Enforcement Task Force will be able to work on those issues. That the professionals of prosecution and investigation will work on that. And the contact group, again, as I said, the contact group has been established to do some particular job that it has done, and we should really think about now closing it down maybe and giving to appropriate organizations which have the appropriate mandate the work that it should do. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister.
Before I give back the floor to Mr. Doucet, may I suggest the room to join me in a very warm, loud applause for those panelists. Thank you very much. Mr. Doucet, the floor is yours because this is the Conference of African Union and Togo. So please give us the final word. Thank you.
Thank you. I like just to tell you thank you to International Peace Institute and OBP for this initiative, this meeting today. We discussed this morning about, I think, a lot of things without only maritime security in Africa. We discussed about pollution, environment, piracy, illicit traffic, fishing, illegal fishing too. We think the Lomé summit is not only a Togolese summit. Like you know, is the African Union summit. During the discussion, for example, the Ambassador Roger Lacan said, we have to take just 2 pages for our African charter. I can say yes, but we can decide only in Togo. Africa is 54 countries. Before you take the decision, before you decide to do something, you have to consult each countries in African continent. That you see is a little bit difficult to decide only in Togo. I think we discuss, we hear everything somebody say today. We will try to discuss together with African Union Commission, and before this Lomé summit, maybe we can decide something like just 2 or 3 pages of Togo charter. We need in Africa peace and security. We think for African peace, for African development, we have to begin to resolve the African problem by African leaders, by African peoples. That way we decide, the African Union and Togolese government decides to organize this summit in Lomé. I think after this summit, we can see you again to discuss about only African development. For us, African is a continent of future. We can believe in African force. In African, we don't have only Shabab or Boko Haram or malaria or, a lot of problems that we in Africa, we want to take our future. We want to take our destiny. And please believe in Africa future, believe in us, and we can work together. Thank you so much.